One of the most common objections I hear around plant-based nutrition is how difficult it is to digest. I've heard it all. Bloating, gas, irregular bowel movements, reflux, and people just having a hard time digesting grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes. Now, in the world of holistic nutrition, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to anything because we really take a deep look at the individual, their needs, their preferences, their tastes, and also their goals and where they're trying to head in life. However, there are a few things that we can agree on in this world. And the first is that we always want to take our awareness to our digestive fire, which we call Agni in Ayurveda. And when we have a strong burning digestive fire, it allows us to not only break down, but also to assimilate the nutrients in the foods that we're consuming. If we have a weak digestive fire or low Agni, it can mean that we're putting foods in, but they're not actually getting digested, and this can leave us with symptoms, which are really, really uncomfortable. So in today's lesson, I'm going to be teaching you about food activation. And food activation is a very simple, low effort, and really powerful way that you can alchemize your nutrients, alchemize your ingredients from being something that cause you pain to being something that actually support the gut healing process. My name is Amy. I'm a holistic nutritionist, an Ayurvedic practitioner, a human design reader, and a yoga teacher who's here on a mission to support you in healing your gut so that you can feel radiant from the inside out. In today's lesson, I'm going to share a clip from a training that I did inside of my holistic plant-based nutrition program, and I hope that you enjoy. Let's discuss food activation. This is so important for plant-based people, especially if you're more Vata dominant. However, all of the doshas will benefit greatly from food activation. If you struggle with bloating and gas or indigestion, activated foods are going to help with this. Soaking. You can soak nuts, seeds, grains, and legumes. If you add a pinch of salt, it's going to help with the process of breaking down those anti-nutrients that I talked about earlier, which make digestion difficult. After soaking, for the allotted time, you can consume them as is. You can dehydrate or roast them, making sure that they're totally bone dry. And if you've dehydrated or roasted, then at this point you can store them in an airtight container for later use. And soaking is typically between 3 and 12 hours, depending on the chosen ingredient. Dehydration varies depending on your climate. However, I do recommend dehydration. It's going to keep the food more active. And of course, dehydration is also going to depend on your climate, the tools that you're using, whether you're using a dehydrator or an oven, and how much of an ingredient you're working with. For a regular sized baking tray of soaked almonds, for example, it might take up to 8 or 12 hours to fully dry in the oven at a low temperature. And my oven goes to 170 degrees Fahrenheit, which works pretty well for me. If your oven goes lower, even better. Sprouting. If you want to take it an extra step with any nuts, seeds, grains, or legumes, you can do so after soaking them. Basically, sprouting is exactly what it sounds like, and it might add an extra 1 to 10 days to this process. You could use a sprouting tray or a glass jar with cheesecloth or mesh and a rubber band. Of course, these are extra steps that make the world of difference. And if you're feeling intimidated by the length of time that it takes, there are many ways to work this into your daily life. Generally speaking, soaking and sprouting are low maintenance and they require very little of your energy. You just need to plan it properly. So, some pro tips for you. If you buy almonds, soak them right away before storing them. After they've been soaked, you can dehydrate them until they're bone dry, make sure there's no moisture, or you can season and roast them for a kind of different vibe. You could even do batches. You could do some that are seasoned, some that are raw and unseasoned. After, you can store them in your airtight container, and it's again so important to make sure there's no moisture, otherwise they'll go moldy. And when you do this, you're going to have some ready to eat, easy to digest nuts for the next X number of months until you run out. Another pro tip, and Always make sure that you're buying raw ingredients. Some nuts that you can buy at the store are already roasted and seasoned, and you cannot soak and sprout those. They've already been through a different process. Fermentation. Fermented foods and drinks are pretty trendy right now. However, there's nothing new or trendy about fermentation. Humans have been consuming fermented and preserved foods since the Neolithic era. It's a traditional, ancient food preparation technique that would ensure that you could eat fresh produce long after harvest was over. This is one major benefit alongside the positive effects that they can have on your gut microbiome was the longevity. In regards to fermentation, there are three terms that you might come across: wild fermentation, lactofermentation, and culturing. Though these ideas do overlap, they're actually three different processes. Wild fermentation occurs when microbes, bacteria, naturally found on foods or in the air in your environment are used to initiate the fermentation process. Essentially, it's spontaneous fermentation. For example, the initial process of creating a sourdough starter illustrates wild fermentation as it uses the wild yeast from the air. That is why a sourdough starter, rather, originating in a different country, one in Thailand and then one in North America, would taste very different from one another. Different locations, different environmental yeasts. Sauerkraut is another example of wild fermentation. Sauerkraut uses the naturally occurring bacteria on the cabbage, which is called lactobacillus. It's the most common bacterial strain. And it breaks down and ferments in an anaerobic environment, which means without any oxygen. That's why we close the lid when we're making sauerkraut. If it's left exposed to oxygen, the cabbage would simply mold. The anaerobic environment, paired with some salt, keeps the bad bacteria away and allows the beneficial bacteria, the lactobacillus, to turn into lactic acid. This results in the sour tasting fermented cabbage that we know and love called sauerkraut. Lactofermentation, aka lactic acid fermentation, is a variant of wild fermentation. So, lactobacillus is present on anything grown in earth, right? On the earth. Sauerkraut is actually an example of both wild and lactofermentation. The naturally occurring lactobacillus bacteria found on cabbage feeds on sugar, the natural sugars that occur in food, and then produces lactic acid as a byproduct. And this, with a little bit of help from salt and an anaerobic environment, again, an oxygen free environment, these foods naturally ferment. And then culturing generally means that there have been some sort of microbial starter used to initiate that fermentation. Common microbial starters include scobies and powdered starter cultures. So, water kefir is an example of culturing. The water kefir grains, if ever you've seen them, if not, a quick Google search away can show you, are grain sized symbiotic colonies of bacteria and yeast, little grain sized scobies. And these grains feed on sugar water, actually, um, and produce a cultured beverage like water kefir or kombucha is a good example. And also some fermented condiments, there's, fermented mustards and fermented ketchup, etc., are also considered cultured, yogurts as well. As you can see, wild ferments can also be lactoferments, but not always. A lactoferment is a wild ferment, and culturing is a fermentation process where a microbial starter is used. I sincerely hope that this lesson was supportive to help you understand the different ways you can activate your ingredients. If you are already doing this, that's wonderful. Let me know below if you learned anything new in this lesson. And if you're totally new to this world of food activation or even plant-based nutrition, welcome. I'm so happy that you're here and that you're curious. If any questions come up, or even if you want me to go deeper into one of these subjects or possibly do a video on how I activate foods in my house, let me know in the comments section below. I do my best to get to every one of the questions that are in there, and it always makes me happy to see you guys engaging. If you liked this video, I'm going to invite you to go ahead and give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. That's going to be really supportive for me, and it's also really good feedback that you enjoy this type of content. And if you didn't like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs down. Full permission to you. That feedback is also really helpful for me to make sure that I'm making the right type of content that's going to support you on your wellness journey.